Welcome to this tutorial where we take a look on how we can issue an SD-JWT VC Credential via OID4VCI version 1 using the walt.id open source Issue SD-JWT. For the wallet, we will be using the walt.id wallet API, also the version 2, which supports the OID4VCI V1. Now, what I already did locally, I cloned the walt.id identity repository, which has the Docker Compose, which we can use to bring up all of the required services in one command. So in my terminal, I already am in the Docker Compose folder and can now do a Docker Compose up. Now this Docker Compose now brings up all the different services, including the Issue SD-JWT as well as the wallet too. So to now go through this tutorial on how we can issue an SD-JWT VC, first of all, we need to make sure we have it up and running, which we just did, and also make sure we have a test wallet available, which we can then use to receive our credential into. So now moving here to the wallet Swagger and going here to the create wallet endpoint, we can now simply create ourselves a new wallet. So I have now here the wallet ID, and we can now go ahead and create a new key for that specific wallet. So here I will insert my wallet ID, and then we create a local key. So basically the backend JWK just means here we are using a local key, which is stored in the database of the wallet instead of using, for example, an external HSM. So we now created a key of the type XP256R1, which we can now use then later to receive the credential. Now for the SD-JWT VC, we don't need a DID, so we can leave that out for the moment and thereby return now to move on to our next step. So we have our test wallet set up, and so we can now start with the issuance. Now the walt.id Issuer API uses what we call credential profiles. So by default, when you clone the walt.id identity repository, it already comes with a set of default profiles that can be used to play around with the API or common credential profiles that you also might want to issue later. And so what we will do now for this tutorial, we will be issuing an identity credential, which has the profile ID identity credential SD-JWT. And so what we can now do is go to our walt.id issuer, here also in the Swagger, and then go to the endpoint to request a specific profile. So here I will insert that specific ID, and we will see here in the response that we get back a profile. Now a profile is mapped to also the credential issuer metadata. So if we take one step back and look at the issuer metadata here in the configurations, which are applied when we bring up the Docker Compose file. So looking here at the credential issuer metadata, you can see here a few different credential configurations. So these are the credentials which this issuer is supporting to issue, like for example, a bank ID in the WVC format. And here we will also find our identity credential, which we just requested the profile for. So basically we have the issuer metadata, which advertises over the OID4VCI endpoint, so the protocol endpoint, to other like wallets, for example, the different credentials it supports. And then the walt.id issuer builds on top of this issuer metadata, so-called issuer profiles. Now an issuer profile, which we just also requested, maps onto a credential configuration ID of the credential issuer metadata. And so the credential profile simply defines certain defaults that will be applied when we then later create a credential offer, which then the wallet can claim of that specific profile. So for example, here we specify an issuer key, which uses the default issuer key, an issuer DID, which uses the default issuer DID, some credential data, some mappings, which are using our data functions to then insert at the time of credential signing, for example, the timestamp in seconds, and also configure selectively disclosable attributes, as the SD-JWT VC enables the selective disclosure of specific attributes. Like here, for example, we say that birth date, so this at the top right here, should be selectively disclosable, meaning that by default, when a verifier requests a credential, this field won't be shared. Now, all of this can also be overwritten later with so-called runtime overrides. So it's not that you only can define it here in the issuer profiles, but it's one way of doing so next to the credential runtime overrides later when we create the credential issuance offer. So now back at the issuer, we've seen that we get our credential profile. So this is correctly configured. And so the next step is that we create a credential offer based off of this credential profile we just checked out. So going here back into the tutorial, we will now do this creation step, creating an OID4VCI credential offer by pasting here this body. So first of all, we define our profile ID, which we just queried for to make sure, okay, we use this specific credential profile, which is configured here in this configuration file with all of these data fields. Plus, we say the authentication method is pre-authorized. As with the OpenID4VCI, we have two different variations. So we have the pre-authorized code flow, which assumes the user is already authenticated when claiming the offer. For example, when they log into a specific website with their credentials, and after they've logged in, they see a QR code to scan and then receive a credential into their wallet. Here, the user is already authenticated. Another flow is the authorization code flow, where the user has to authenticate towards an external IDP in order to then claim the credential. But here we use just the pre-authorized code flow. When we execute this, we get back our credential offer. We can also configure webhooks or use server-side events to then get updates during the different issuance stages. So the next step is to receive now this credential. So we will get back to our wallet, and here we use now the credential receive endpoint. Now here we simply need to use our offer URL provided, and then we also need, of course, our wallet ID from the beginning. And now we can see we have received the credential with this specific ID. Now what we can do is use this ID and now get the actual data of that credential. And so we can see now we have received our SD-JWT. So we can see here the type. We can see also the disclosures. So here we can see now, okay, birth date is actually a selectively disclosable field, as we also specified here in this credential profile in the issuer configuration. And here we can now also see the full credential signed. So we can also take this without the disclosures, which start here with the tilde sign, and go, for example, to walt.io and paste it. And then we can see here the credential with all of the different data attributes, which were also defined in the profile for this particular credential. And with this, we have claimed our credential using OID4VCI V1. Now, as a next step, what we will do is we define our own credential type and then our own credential profile on top of this type. And so the first thing what we will need to do is go to our credential issuer metadata configuration file and here add our own custom credential type. And this can be any type that we want to support. So we can completely here come up with our own custom type that we need for our particular use case. Now in this case, I would just create a my identity credential. Also here I use like specific values like the VCT base URL, which then in the background creates an own VCT URL, which promotes then to a wallet, for example, like metadata for the specific credential type, like name and the description, which we could also see if we go quickly back here into the wallet. You will see here also in the credential itself the specific VCT, which is the metadata for this particular credential type. And we could also take a look at this if we wanted to. So we could go here into the issue itself and get this value out of it. And so we see here the metadata for the specific credential, like a name and the description. Now this can be all configured and defined. There can also be an externally hosted VCT or URL. Here we just use this value to generate one, or the issuer then generates one for this particular credential. And then we specify things like the binding methods, the signing algorithms, and the proof types that should be supported. And then on top of this, we will then need our credential profile, which defines all of the data and the mappings and the disclosures for this new credential type. So here I also uncomment this and save that. And so the one thing we will need to do, because now we just edited the configurations files, which are mounted into the Docker Compose. And so if we now would like take this ID here for the profile we just created and go back to our issuer and would try to get this, we see here that there's no credential found with this specific identifier. Now that's why we will need to go back to my running instance, stop this and bring it back up to then apply the changes. And then when we do now an execution again, we see that our new credential is there. Now, what we now will do, we will use, when we do create now a credential offer based on this type, we will use what I already mentioned, so-called runtime overrides. And so here you will add additional fields like attendee name, ticket tier, event to the credential profile we specified here. So next to those two fields. Additionally, we could also override these two fields by simply specifying them here in the runtime overrides. So when we now execute this again, we take our offer URL, we will go to the wallet. To receive it, we will now provide it here in the receive call of the wallet. We get back our ID. And when we now take a look at this specific credential, we will see here that we have our two names, like our two values from our credential profile, which we specified here. But we also have, in addition, the values we provided via our runtime overrides. Now with this, we have seen, first of all, how we can use one of the default profiles which already ship by default with the issue 2, but we also seen how we can add our custom profile by specifying it in the issue metadata as well as the issue profiles to then issue a custom credential. And with that said, you can find also in the description the link to the written guide of this tutorial. And with that, happy building and see you next time.